Wrapped in Taruma's embrace, Suru entered a deep dream and was transported to experience the past. He saw white men dressed in strange clothes that reached their feet. They kept Bibles in their hands and stood to the side of a big cross. In the middle of the forest, they were speaking to the people with an authoritarian attitude, sometimes in Latin. Some persons seemed to be curious, while others boasted the arrogance of those who claimed to be bearers of truth. Though something drew Suru's attention, there were more natives than the whites. "Do you recognize these men?" Tarumã pointed to those men who were not the indigenous ones. "They are the Jesuits. For more than 300 years, the Jesuit mission put together different groups of indigenous people, among them the Chiquitano people. But this came at a cost. The Catholic religion and white men's culture were imposed to weaken you. They tried to silence you all, to extinguish your culture and your worldview by means of physical and spiritual violence." Suddenly, a new image appeared. There was a clearing in the middle of the forest where some members of the Chiquitano people were sitting on the ground. Meanwhile, a Jesuit was speaking and pointing out a statue of a Catholic saint holding an open Bible. Tarumã explained that the speech intended to teach the native adults and children how to read the Bible and worship the Catholic saints and the Catechism. Suru then saw an indigenous person being thrown at the feet of a cross. The man was wounded and alone. He was still alive, but weak. He still had the traditional body paint and clothes. "He is like me," Suru said, squeezing his own hands as strongly as his heart got squeezed. He sadly remembered the stories that the elders used to tell him about the suffering experienced by the Chiquitano people, who firmly resisted the white men who marked not only their bodies but also the environment. The more they invaded the lands, the less forest there was. The elders of the village tell stories about it. They say that the Chiquitano people's suffering increased over time and with the destruction of nature. "You are right, Suru," said Tarumã. "The environmental devastation intensified when the white men invaded the lands. I remember that they made a certain law of the lands, the law of lands. This law allowed more foreigners to occupy the Chiquitano people's lands on the border between Brazil and Bolivia, building big farms around plantations, the fazendas. The owners exploited the indigenous labor through forced services. The situation only got worse. The anguish seized each inch of Suru's body. What he was seeing was frightening. Surely it was caused by the war. The Chiquitano people were fighting against foreigners. The villages were burning. There were bodies everywhere, and the ground turned red with blood. The Chiquitano people resisted, but the pain would never be forgotten." Now the image showed fallen trees, animals running away, and people losing their huts and even their lives. White men were forcing some indigenous, adults and children, to work on their farms. Those who were trying to escape were shot. If it were not for Tarumã holding him, maybe he would have passed out. "How could all this get worse?" Suru asked, while his tears were flowing down along the waters. Tarumã thought that it was safer to take Suru to a quiet place, going back to the place they were before. In the end, she would not darken the kids' hopes. Once back in that calm place, Tarumã spoke again. "I am taking you back to 1970, when the Institute of Colonization and Agrarian Reform, INCRA, was established in Brazil and the agrarian reform started." How did this agrarian reform affect the Chiquitano people? With the reform, the Brazilian state started to register the landowners' titles of the lands as if they were the real owners, disregarding the indigenous traditional tenure. This changed the traditional structure and features of the villages, separated families, and reduced the indigenous territory. It also increased the pressure on the Chiquitano people's culture and worldview. Sacred and important sites are in the possession of these fazendeiros. "But we Chiquitano are strong, and we resisted," Suri shouted fearlessly. Yes, you resisted, explained Tarumã, but your people decreased in number due to the process of oppression perpetrated by large local landowners and local public power. Many of you have come to deny your indigenous origin. True. My grandmother's brother did that to get a job. My grandma said that at that time my family was starving, and my great-grandma was seriously ill. There was no money to buy food and medication. The fazenderos who stole the Chiquitano people's lands and condemned them to misery took advantage of that misfortune. They only offered jobs to those who self-declared as not indigenous and spoke no other language than Portuguese. The pay was low and the work shift was intense. My grandma used to say to her mother, my great-grandma, was very proud of her indigenous origins, and she died shortly after her son went to work on a farm. My grandmother said that she died from grief. Yes, so it is. Not only did your grandmother's brother deny his descent from the Chiquitano people, unfortunately, this oppression continued without any intervention from the public power side. Until the 1990s, many of us generally used to live in villages without acknowledging their Chiquitano origins. Even though not all of them self-defined themselves as indigenous, they still used to observe their rituals. Like the Curuse, asked Suru. Yes, exactly. What a beautiful ceremony, Tarumã said, as she waved its waters to show him the cheerful party as a reward for such suffering, showing that not all got lost. Despite all the oppression, it was time to show that the Chiquitano people's culture resisted indeed. Hey, wait! I remember about this Curuse. I took part in it last year, Suru said as he remembered with happiness. I had a lot of fun. My mom said that this year it is going to be even better. I can't understand how some Chiquitano could deny our culture. It is so rich and lovely. I am so proud to be a Chiquitano, and I say this to everyone who wants to listen. Now, my dear, said Tarumã as she put her hand to her mouth while laughing, this time a little bit louder. You are right to be proud of your culture and of the strength of your people. You bet. But Tarumã, what do you think? Is it possible? I mean, people are leaving and pretending to be like the white people. Tarumã stayed in silence for a moment, considering the boy's question. We can say that since the year 2000, we are living a transformation as the Chiquitano people are being rediscovered by the Brazilian government. Rediscovered? How? What do you mean? We have been here for many years, haven't we? It happened that they needed to build an international gas pipeline between Bolivia and Brazil, so they had to study the region. Thus, they made an environmental impact study, and they realized that there was an indigenous group living in that region. From that time, many people identified themselves as Chiquitano people. Did the inhabitants of that region respect them? The conversation was getting on to a delicate issue, hard to deal with. Suru guessed that bad things were coming. Unfortunately, no, said Tarumã. The people who declared themselves as Chiquitano people had problems. They were threatened by the fazenderos. Chiquitano people from Vila Nova Barbecho, for example, could not go shopping in the near village because they feared suffering violence or even being murdered. It seems that to identify yourself as a Chiquitano is an act of bravery. It's true. Courage is and always will be an important element of the Chiquitano people. Suru wondered how difficult this could have been for kids like him. That was not long ago, right? How were other Chiquitano children treated? At that time, there were no schools in the villages, so the children had to leave their hometown to study in other places, where the Chiquitano people's cosmovisions were not regarded as scientific, and therefore not part of the school curriculum. In these schools, the Chiquitano children suffered prejudice. They were called names, Bug, and Indians. In particular, the word Indian is considered something bad and humiliating. It was at that time that the Chiquitano people, together with the Municipal Department of Education of Mato Grosso, started to fight to open schools in the villages so as to respect their culture. If it weren't for this, I wouldn't have a school to study, right? Maybe you would have, but it is in another city, outside the village, with no one that could teach you the things about your village or culture, explained Tarumã. Ah, good. I am happy that they took care of that. I like that school. My parents always tell me that education is very important. Yes, indeed. But teaching must respect your culture. Unfortunately, we find ourselves now in the opposite situation of violence and cultural oppression. You are right. I learned that violence does not lead to anything good, said Suru. Yes, unfortunately, not all people respect others in nature. Human rights violations are constant through explicit and tacit violence. Everyone in my village knows we have to respect others and nature. We depend on it, and there will not be any more Chiquitanos if there is no healthy environment. But the landowners do not help, right? Unfortunately, I agree with you, they don't. Actually, do you know they pollute the waters, the soil, and the air? Seriously? Yelled Suru in shock. Yes, said Tarumã. They pollute everything using agrotoxic products, which affect people's health in general. And in particular, pregnant women who come into contact with those substances have many health problems. I can't understand why. Why can't they see they are hurting people and you? Is it so clear that they cannot see? How is it possible they don't see? It seems that the situation affects only the inhabitants of the village, but if it is going to continue like it is, it's going to affect the world. I don't understand what these people think about. Tarumã was surprised to see that Suru, who was just a kid, was able to realize all the consequences of human actions. Exactly. I have to admit that it is difficult for me as well to understand it. I can't help you. I didn't understand either how something that I thought to be easy and logical can be ignored in this way, said Tarumã. Suru, unable to understand how this could happen, asked, Why doesn't the government help? My dad says that they must help us. Yes, we can't forget that the Brazilian state has its faults. How? Brazilian legislation guarantees indigenous rights like the Chiquitano people's rights. I am talking about the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Brazil of 1988, of Brazilian laws and international agreements of which Brazil is a state party. This looks so complicated and difficult to understand. It is indeed. Because of this, as I said, you don't need to know everything, but there are some things that you need to remember and that I can't leave to explain to you. So please, Suru, be patient, said Tarumã.